All right, so we got some pretty major updates coming out of the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine, as the Biden administration is apparently going to be making a massive $33 billion funding request to Congress for Ukraine, and they say over $20 billion is for military assistance, and this is on top of the roughly $3 to $4 billion in assistance we've already given them on this front. And they say $8.5 billion is going to be going to economic assistance, and $3 billion is going to be going for humanitarian assistance. Now, first of all, just at face value, this is a gigantic fucking number. This would easily be the most military aid that we have given to any country in recent memory. But on top of that, I mean, if you just take this in context, I mean, this is $33 billion going to Ukraine for military assistance after, programs like free community college that Joe Biden was putting forward are like 1/3 of this cost. And we were told that that is somehow too expensive for the American people to deserve, but somehow we're able to come up with this on the fly like it's absolutely nothing and just print this money and, use these weapons to enrich weapons manufacturers here in the United States to assist Ukraine. So listen, we're going to get into all of the debates back and forth as to whether or not this is even productive or whether or not this is going overboard in military assistance, while also understanding that you want Ukraine to have the ability to push back against Russian aggression. But I think that this quote down here really says it all in terms of the perspective of the United States right now as to what the goals of this war are. So they say that the admin says that this is what's needed to enable Ukraine's success for the next 5 months of the war. So they're kind of seemingly already anticipating that this is going to be drawn out for months and months and months, instead of potentially trying to reach an urgent diplomatic settlement, which in my opinion should be the primary focus. Now, again, there's a lot of context surrounding this that we've been talking about on this channel recently. You have this angle that we heard from CNN. What really happens to weapons sent to Ukraine? The US doesn't really know. So I'll put this down in the description if you want to go and reread this or watch my previous video covering this. But, on the one hand, you do want to support Ukrainians having the ability to push back against Russian aggression, obviously. But on the other hand, you also don't want to be flooding weapons into a country in a completely unverifiable way with no guardrails whatsoever to determine where these weapons are going to be ending up. And they even talk about in this piece top US defense officials and State Department officials who are acknowledging that there is a threat that could come in the future from potential like militia groups like the Azov Battalion or other far-right nationalists within Ukraine, or on the international market, that these weapons could be ending up in the hands of, and that could obviously have some degree of blowback effects down the line for the domestic political situation in Ukraine and also for the broader geopolitical situation in the surrounding area. So this is an angle you have to, keep your eye on, and you can't just gloss over as if this isn't somehow a problem. But we're doubling down and we're sending them now even, higher record amounts of weapons. In this case, $33 billion in funding is going to be, probably immediately approved by Congress. I can't imagine there's going to be any significant degree of pushback against this. Now, another angle that we just recently heard about in the last couple of days is now the Biden administration is apparently shifting their goals somewhat to now prioritize weakening Russia. So here from NPR, they give us a little bit of details. They say the U.S. war aims shift in Ukraine and bring additional risks. So what are they talking about here? Well, in Poland, after a long train trip to Kyiv to meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was blunt about the U.S. goals in the conflict in Ukraine. And he said, "We want to see Russia weakened to the degree that it can't do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine." And they say the United States and its allies now believe Ukraine can win the war against Russia. Now, what exactly they mean by win the war against Russia is pretty much where this entire conversation needs to be centered around. But they say it's a significant change in thinking, bolstered by the successes of the Ukrainian military in holding its own and pushing Russia's military back from Kyiv over the course of 2 months of combat. So yeah, they have done an absolutely fantastic job in basically embarrassing the Russian military so far. And if you look at a map of exactly where we're at right now, they completely failed in taking the western portions of Ukraine, the main capital city, obviously here in Kyiv. They committed plenty of atrocities in the process of trying to take this territory, but nonetheless, they failed and were successfully pushed back. And now it looks like Russia's priorities have essentially shifted to focusing in here on the eastern portion of Ukraine in the Donbas region and attempting to form this land bridge connection down here towards the Crimean Peninsula. So it looks like that's what Russia's goals are going to be in terms of a military or strategic or political success now from their perspective would be holding the Donbass, protecting these, as Vladimir Putin called them, independent republics of Donetsk and Lugansk down here in the east, and again, forming this land bridge connection, which requires, taking cities like Mariupol and potentially even Odessa down here to the southwest. So if those are the goals of Vladimir Putin from a objective political and military objective from his perspective, if that's his goals, then this is where the primary focus should be in a potential diplomatic off-ramp. It's no longer necessarily about protecting the future existence of the current government of Ukraine under Zelensky. It seems like it's much more now about territorial claims in this region. And so there are eventually, there's only a couple different ways that this war is going to end. Number one, as Noam Chomsky has been saying, it could end with the complete annihilation of Ukraine in its entirety if, the war escalates to the point where Vladimir Putin feels like he needs to use tactical nukes or significantly escalate the military presence that he's been flooding into Ukraine. That's one option. Or the second option, which is the obviously preferable one, is a diplomatic settlement. And unfortunately, the reality of the situation is you don't want Russia to succeed, obviously, in an ideal world in any of their objectives in this invasion. But the unfortunate reality of the situation is if there's going to be, which there needs to be, an inevitable diplomatic settlement, then it's going to require some very, very difficult concessions by Ukraine that nobody is really going to be happy with. Ukraine's not going to be happy with it. The U.S. is not going to be happy with it. Russia's not going to be happy with it, whatever the compromise ends up being, again, whether that's recognizing Lugansk and Donetsk as independent republics, or whether it's, finally acknowledging that Ukraine or that the Crimean Peninsula is no longer part of Ukraine and it's part of Russia. There's going to need to be some difficult concessions that nobody is going to be happy with if you're going to end this war in as soon a way as possible and prevent further destruction of Ukraine and prevent further, civilian casualties and harm to the country. So that's the current situation in terms of a military sense. Now, obviously, there are some additional risks to flooding this country with this type of weaponry to potentially even enable Ukraine to now, instead of being on the defensive, go on a somewhat offensive campaign. So they continue here saying that we believe, this is Lloyd Austin again, we believe that we can win. They can win if they have the right equipment, the right support, Austin said. And they say the U.S. is rushing in long-range artillery, other weapons and ammunition as the battle shifts to the east and south of Ukraine. And Washington has delivered $3.7 billion in security assistance to Ukraine since Russia's full-scale invasion began in February, according to the State Department. And the most recent deliveries include howitzer cannons, which Pentagon officials believe will be useful in the flat terrain of eastern Ukraine's Donbass region. And they say Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, who also visited Kyiv last week, has repeatedly said the war in Ukraine should be a strategic defeat for Russian President Vladimir Putin and will leave Russia weakened. So listen, again, in an ideal world, do I want Vladimir Putin to succeed in any of his goals? No, of course you don't. He's a violent oligarch, offensive actor in this specific instance, and you don't want to see him succeed on any of these different fronts. But again, Vladimir Putin, you also have to get inside his mind and understand that he's, number one, a complete fucking lunatic, and number two, is not going to simply sit back and allow Russia to have a strategic defeat or allow himself to be completely embarrassed in front of the Russian people. So you have to balance the facts, basically, of what Putin actually wants from this war, what potential, off-ramps or diplomatic settlements he would be willing to engage in, and also understand that, again, he does have a nuclear arsenal that their military doctrine explicitly states that if there's some sort of a threat to a, weakened Russian government, or if there's a perceived threat to the current government order within Russia, that they will use a lot of those, tactical nuclear weapons. So if the goal here, as it should be, is to end the war as quickly as possible and to try to push for diplomacy as quickly as possible, then, there is an extent to which flooding this country with infinite weapons instead of putting the priority on that diplomacy could be detrimental and could in fact lead to a further escalation that broadens the war and that doesn't actually result in any better situation for average Ukrainian people. So, that's the current situation. Again, they've warned against this type of action from the United States. Now, again, you kind of got to balance a number of different things, and this is why it's difficult, especially especially as a principled anti-war leftist. This is why it's difficult to engage in these types of conversations, because again, I do support Ukraine having the ability, obviously, to defend themselves from Russian aggression. But at the same time, if your priority is for the average, civilian populations within Ukraine, and having Ukraine maintain, some semblance of a country without it being flattened to the ground, well, you have to acknowledge the goals of Vladimir Putin. You have to acknowledge his priorities, and also understand that he's not going to just sit back and allow Russia to suffer a massive strategic defeat in this instance. He's much more likely to resort to escalating the war, to escalating the military presence in Ukraine, as well as potentially using those nuclear weapons that he does have in his arsenal. So again, you kind of have to balance all of those different things and understand that, a lot of this is up to what Ukraine themselves is willing to do and what their priorities are. Do they want to continue fighting? Do they want to even potentially escalate to try to retake Crimea, for example? A lot of this is going to depend on exactly what Zelensky wants to do and what his goals are. But this type of shit is honestly terrifying, because if you're giving them all of these different weapons, which U.S. officials are openly acknowledging does have added risks, that you don't necessarily know where in the country they're going to be ending up or where in the global market they're going to be ending up, there are those additional blowback risks that could come from this. And at the end of the day, the main thing that we should be trying to avoid is, well, two things we should be trying to avoid is, number one, you want to obviously avoid further damage to Ukraine, and number two, you want to avoid broadening this conflict and dragging in, for example, NATO forces into this conflict, because World War III would be significantly worse, not just for the Ukrainian people, but also obviously for the entire international order.